Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Master Your Mental podcast. I'm looking forward to diving into this topic of psychological flexibility despite injury with my incredible guest today. I am joined by Keagen Hadley, who is an occupational therapist doctor specializing in using psychological treatments such as acceptance and commitment therapy to improve the lives of his patients. He also just achieved one of his amazing lifelong dreams of completing his book titled Torn: Overcoming the Psychological Challenges Post-ACL Injury. I'm excited to have you hear Keagen's story of the impact his injury had on his career as a semi-professional football player and how he turned this obstacle into a tool to help others. So, without further ado, welcome Keagen to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm definitely excited to be here.
Yes, of course. And I am as well, you guys. He has his book that is, you just told me this right now, is coming out May 17th.
Mm-hmm.
And it was supposed to be June, but it's coming out earlier. So we're going to be getting into that as well as a story here with the value in terms of recovering from these things. But I love to hear from you, Keagen, about this. So can you share with us the story of your injury and the psychological impact that had on your life?
Yeah. So, anyone who's been an athlete for extended period of time, like for me, I was an athlete for 25 years, a quarter century. So it's a long time, and it becomes really, embedded in who you are, and just what you identify as. Like, so you meet someone. What do you do? I play football here, or, I'm a soccer player, or whatever the case may be. And it just really becomes who you are. So to have that taken away so quickly was really awful for me. It happened first on my left leg when I was a junior in college. So it was fall camp. And that was awful because I was just making the transition from high school to college is, it can be quite a change for sure. So I was just finally coming on to my own and starting to really thrive. And then that happened. So that was really frustrating for me. And I took like a month and a half or so to rehab. Actually, I was rather determined to play that year. So I still ended up playing, I think 3 games that year with a brace on. And then after the season, I had surgery. Next year, I would unfortunately find out I was a transfer from an NCAA school. So I actually had too many credits to play my senior year. So I was completely, shattered at that point. And then I kind of redirected myself to, training again for arena football. And I was lucky enough to, get signed by a minor team there and then pick up an agent. And I actually unfortunately tore my ACL, the right one, in Ohio for a private Canadian Football League tryout.
So it wasn't one, it was 2.
Yeah, I've torn both of them. They're both equal. Everything's equal. So.
Oh my goodness. And just hearing from you too, when you're diving into not just that, like, I like how you also bring up the fact of the identity piece of doing this for over 25 years, being an athlete and having that as what you identify as, and then having that stripped away with the injury and not just one side, but then both. And then recovering from that is extremely a huge challenge when that's literally what you've dedicated so much of your life to. So I would love if you can talk about, like, I'd love to see if you even had this idea of writing Torn, and who are you speaking to in regards to the messages inside of the book?
Yeah. So, like I said, I always kind of identified strictly as an athlete. That's what I focused all my time on. But I remember distinctly sitting in English class. I think it was freshman year of college, going, I really like writing. Maybe I should write a book someday. And then in the back of my head, I talk about this in the book, but we all have these thoughts that we can't really control. And sometimes, they're not helpful at all. So my thought at that time was, oh, you'll never make money doing that unless, you write Harry Potter 27 or something like that. So I kind of squashed that, unfortunately. So I didn't plan on doing this. Actually, I'm one of those people who um, dives deep into things and does like a lot of research. And after I, did a bunch of research after I had some additional trauma in my life, actually, my ACL tears aren't even what prompted me to go into this at all or learn any of the skills necessary. But um, I learned more about acceptance and commitment therapy out of necessity. And then, I got a lot of my own therapy, obviously, to get through my own issues, and then realized, this would have been really helpful, a number of years ago, because now pretty much my entire life revolves around helping other people who are in similar situations that I was in. So I have a very good, family, friends and everything else, but no one really prepared me for how to deal with these psychological issues when your outlet is taken away. So for athletes, who we are, our outlets, like everything that, regulates how we are on a daily basis is our sport. So say, I have a good day at practice. It's a good day. And if it wasn't a good day, all you have to do is, adjust physically what you need to do to have a good day. So it's all very simple. But when that goes away, it can get real dark, because we haven't cultivated any mental skills at all, through 25 years of our life, and then we're stuck there. Usually, when it really starts to hit you is it's really common practice nowadays. So I tore my ACL. You wait and have to get the MRI and get that confirmation that yes, it's torn. You have to come to practice, and you have to watch other people do exactly what you want to be doing. You have to have someone fill your spot. You have to watch them do that. So that's when you really realize, hey, I don't have any of the skills necessary to take this on.
And then especially when you bring up the acceptance and commitment therapy, I'd love if you can get into that, because you did just outline right there with the psychological impact of having that outlet, which is football, sports, going to that as a way to help you with the effects of the stress. But now that's gone. And then you also mentioned, all the therapy that you did yourself. And then also with the ACL tear, that wasn't the thing that prompted you to write the story. So I'd love if you can kind of get into that, and then also mention, if you could pinpoint one thing that was the most helpful in terms of helping you with the psychological aspect, like what does that look like?
Okay, so I've always kind of joked. It's kind of a dark humor, I guess. But I learned when I was in grad school, I always had my, clinical supervisors and anything like that. I would just have them throw me into doing things, because I can't, sit in the back of class and, listen to someone else talk about things or anything like that. I have to physically do it. And generally, I have to physically do it and fail at it horribly, and then learn from that. So what actually caused me to learn some of these things was out of necessity. So after I tore my second ACL, I was rather lost. I closed off from a lot of people in my life and ruined a number of friendships, relationships, and things like that. And I made some poor relationship decisions, and ended up with a relationship where my significant other was an alcoholic. And due to that, I had, about a year and a half of pretty constant, when I kind of figured out, obviously, that they were an alcoholic. I had never really been around that before. So that was eye-opening. And then, just the constant emotional abuse that came with that. So that's what, led me to, I talk about it in my book, but it led me to some really dark places that I knew my life was not going in the right direction unless I made a drastic change. So.
Wow. And then also you tie in that piece of with the emotional abuse along with having the sports taken away and then the relationships. But then a good thing that you did mention actually is the support system is you mentioned having that, because I know that can play a huge role, especially when you're faced with all these different things and then coming out of that relationship as well. And if you could kind of get into, so with the acceptance and commitment therapy, can you walk us through a little bit of what does that look like?
Yeah. So when people think of acceptance in like mental health, the general thought, I guess, is people mean essentially, oh, just get over it, accept it happened, those kinds of things. And that's not the case at all. I kind of want to make that very, very clear. Acceptance and commitment therapy is essentially taking a really close look at where you are and what you've went through. And unless you do that analysis and open yourself to kind of that pain, you're not going to learn from it. And you're just going to keep running into those issues again. Like, for example, a stat that kind of proves this is, I can't remember the exact number or anything like that, but if you look at individuals who are in, like domestically violent situations, they tend to keep getting in those situations because they're not learning from their past. So, I mean, essentially that kind of goes hand in hand with they're not accepting where they are. And I don't mean accepting like just shut up and stand in the corner kind of thing. I mean, really learning about what they've went through and gaining something from that.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things generally that are the most painful for us, are put there for a reason. It's so we can learn a lesson and grow from it. So kind of learning that is, very instrumental to acceptance and commitment therapy.
Yeah. And I love how you break that down, because when you talk about, you don't just talk, you talk about it in a way of looking at where you are and then also what you went through and all, having that piece of that to really commit, because you bring up the repeating patterns thing. So you'll be in one kind of relationship and then go kind of have that continue, like if you leave, or even in like friendships or environments. And I know you can probably speak to this too, but just basically with your habits and the way that you speak to yourself, your inner dialogue,
Mhm.
and different things like that play a major role in that as well. So I love that you kind of outlined that and mentioned, what this really does is in the commitment piece of that. So for the commitment piece of that, does that mean working towards committing towards finding a solution, or what does that piece look like?
So, it's acceptance and commitment therapy, and there's 6 separate pillars or skills or whatever words you want to use for it. But there's 6 different, I call them skills, that are all act kind of as one, and they all kind of overflow back into each other. So you have obviously acceptance, so we've already talked about. The next one that was probably the most important for me, and it's something I had struggled with long before I tore my ACL. So this was like 10 years in the making, but it's diffusion. So a lot of times, I'll back up just briefly. So it's called diffusion, and in cognitive CBT, for your audience, that's the therapy I went to first after my traumatic experience. So essentially the premise of CBT is to lessen the amount of negative psychological symptomology you're having. So it's trying to lessen that. And they do that by, so if I say, I hate myself, or I'm broken, essentially my personal phrase, I'll use that, is I'm broken. That stuck with me for a long time. And CBT would say, okay, every time you think I am broken, change your thought to a positive one, essentially. Change that to thinking about, your favorite pie, your favorite cake, whatever the case may be. Well, under acceptance and commitment therapy, okay, that didn't work for me at all, because I'm one of those people who, if you tell me not to look over here, I will look over there repeatedly. And I just kept finding myself like gravitating towards, every time I would say, oh, I can't think about that, I would only think about it more. So the slight difference that ACT is it allows you to evaluate the I am broken thought, and then just kind of evaluate it. It gives you some space. So essentially, I'll sum it up like this. Diffusion is the skill in which, instead of me saying I am broken, it's me saying I am having thoughts or feelings that I am broken. So it's giving you that space to where you aren't the thing. Like, just because you're having a thought doesn't mean, it's true. You have to latch onto it or you have to follow it. Just having a good understanding of that and being able to notice, oh, hey, I'm having this thought. That's not helpful. And just kind of let it, pass into wherever it goes, was very, very helpful for me, because for a long time, I'll just be transparent. I had a probably 3-month span where I was suicidal. So I would have those thoughts pretty repeatedly. But in just being able to, after I started getting this therapy, as soon as I would have that thought, it would just pass by. And I knew that I had things that I wanted to accomplish, which is values, which is another one of the skills. So yeah, that's
No,
essentially the most
I
important.
love how you bring up the awareness piece of that, because when you talk about going from I'm broken to having thoughts of being broken, because I love how you're able to like capture those, because especially when you mention having that span of having the suicidal thoughts and it being suicidal, that's something that I can really relate to as well, with the way that like kind of the thought process. But when you break down like how you were able to kind of capture those ones and kind of direct that, or have a different point, you said placing values of the
Mhm.
things that you want to work towards and accomplish, I think is super helpful. And that kind of brings me to something that I want to ask you about like today. So for all the work that you've gone through and the therapy that you've gone through to get to where you are, I know that doesn't just like you do the work and then yeah, you're good, you're completely fixed, like totally not the same. But what do you do today to maintain that progress?
It's a constant work in progress.
Mm-hmm.
I say that because it takes a lot of practice, just like anything else. I had spent, over a quarter century of my life completely, disregarding any kind of um, psychological skill set.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought it was, like most athletes, ridiculous, and I didn't need to waste any time on it. So what I have struggled with the most, I can tell you that, because I have to constantly work on all of these things. What I have had to work on the most is actually values, because
Mm-hmm.
I'm supremely goal driven. I've just had goals always, and I'm always looking towards the next goal, which is another issue I have. Um, but I noticed that even when I would achieve a goal, I didn't feel anything. I don't know if you've ever accomplished a goal and then
Mm-hmm.
it feels a lot more empty than, you spent all this time working towards it, and then, just emptiness. So what I found out, more recently, probably than any of the other skills, was that if you're not linking your values, like who you want to be as a person, what you're working towards, to a goal, I mean, it's not really going to have a lot of meaning, unfortunately. I like to actually, Dr. Stephen Hayes depicted it as values are a compass or a direction, like north, and your goals are kind of like stepping stones in that direction. So you're never going to get to north. You're always striving towards north, but those goals are going to be the stepping stones on your way. So
Oh my gosh. I love that. I think and I love that you bring that up too, especially with tying that into values, and also how like you talk about with yourself being very driven by that. And then having accomplished this thing, or when you tell yourself, okay, like I'm going to do this. And then once I do this, it'll be like this and I'll feel like this. And then I know that everyone can relate to that. And it's almost like, when is it gonna, it's this, and then it's this, and then it's this. And that kind of brings me to this point of almost like manufacturing happiness within yourself to really have that appreciation. And I love that you tie that to the piece of the goal with having the value tied to that, how you laid that out of having that value as a compass and then having those goals as stepping stones to get there. Because that's like when you're working towards something, you want to have that satisfaction of knowing that it's helping you move in the right direction away from the pain that you've previously experienced. And a lot of that came up for me when hearing you mention, like in the past, like before you had your ACL torn, or when you kind of did this work, that you almost viewed almost like therapy and like doing these different things is kind of like ridiculous, which is a big thing that a lot of people still think. But I think it's definitely getting better with more conversations and people being more vulnerable and having the courage like you to actually share your story, and not just share your story, but publish it into a book that people can actually take hold of and read that and say, wow, like look at him. Like if anyone else goes through a period of where they're having an injury, or maybe they have someone that they care for in their life who had this, maybe they had their whole they're like, oh, I'm gonna go to this college and play here, and then they can't, or I'm gonna go do this, and then it's like completely stripped away from, and it's everything they work towards. And having that foundation of like hearing this from you, and also the fact that you bring up maintaining that with the values, and it's not like you've done this and you just kind of, all right, like I'll just try to hope it stays, and like when it comes back I might try to do it again, but you're doing things every day to
Yep.
keep you in that. And I think that's the biggest important piece, especially when you're talking about not just the injury, but the psychological impacts of that with the stress that's associated with it. So, and especially with the work that you do with your clients, like I'd love to hear if like there's any similarities, obviously, that you've seen like with your own experiences with people that you've worked to help.
Yeah. So, I mean, just like anything else, acceptance, ACT and relational frame theory, it kind of gets away from, and there's a reason for it, is I present quite differently than, someone else with severe anxiety, like myself. Everyone's a little different. So it kind of, luckily, the type of framework I practice under, I'm decently well equipped to handle that, but everyone's a little different. Everyone struggles with different aspects of it. So like some individuals that I've worked with have self-esteem issues. They got all of their self-esteem from their sport. They were the best soccer player. They were, whatever the case may be, they felt fitter. Maybe they have actually, they were using sports as a way to stay fit because they kind of have a body image issue, or maybe they already had some, depressive type, tendencies. So they kind of just use the high of working out to stay away from that. So, I mean, there's all kinds of issues you can get in. It's just building those skills around it. Everyone's a little different. Everyone needs, more attention in a couple of the different skills than others, but there's always some similarities. And I always feel, I don't watch a lot of sports now, which is weird actually saying, but if I do, I like to, focus my attention on someone who has torn their ACL, just because I feel kind of like I know them. It's a very weird situation from that standpoint, but I really gravitate towards watching anyone who's been through that, just because I can relate to them on, a bunch of different things and not even have to talk with them. So.
I love how you bring up that aspect of resonating with that and relating with people who've gone through those similar experiences as you, because especially when you talk about the aspect of self-esteem, right, being tied to the sport, and now you don't have that. It's almost like the identity piece that you mentioned kind of in the beginning of like, you identify as this, right? I'm this, and I'm this athlete at this, or I'm this writer, or this is my like profession and occupation. And then you don't have that kind of mentioning, kind of leaning back on those other things, like you said. That what I thought was also interesting that you talked about is that you do things to fail, to learn. Like you mentioned, like you'll try things because you can't just like watch. And that's something that I was like, oh wow, that's funny that you bring that up, because I feel exactly the same. And then, but I feel like when you're going through that loss of whatever it is, do you think that that impact almost holds you back in a way from wanting to try other things to fail? Or what do you think with that?
That's a great question. So essentially, this is my kind of opinion on failure. The first time, it hurts a lot. Um, everyone can kind of picture, one time when you really tasted failure and it hurt. It was awful. We've all been there, but each time you do it, it gets a little bit easier, and eventually, it's really not that bad at all. just from the standpoint. So as long as, especially if you're tapping into, hey, for me, I really want to help individuals who are, have an injury that's putting them out of their sport for a long time, whether it's usually an ACL injury, or in the future, I'm probably going to be working with individuals who are struggling because they're actually losing their, physical abilities and are trying to stay away from total knee surgeries. So I mean, that's mine. That gives me, I will wake up, at 3 a.m. and go to bed at, whenever I have to help those people. So as long as, you're staying in that framework, it really helps out quite a bit.
Yeah, and hearing you mention that kind of brings up the point of seeing that failure, because it's like almost reframing your belief. The way that you used to see it was something that you want to avoid or get away from or move away from. But then the more you lean into that and then allow yourself to have that where it is hard and associated a lot of it with shame and being embarrassed or wanting, it's an uncomfortable feeling. But like you said, when you're able to take yourself out of the comfort zone and continue to do these different things, you really learn a lot. And like that kind of ties into with what you've been talking about with the psychological aspect of like basically strengthening that toolkit that you have. So being able to say, well, I did this, but I learned this from it. And that ties in with your experience. Like you had this ACL injury on both legs, and then, but you learned this from it of how to use that story and capture in a way to relate to not just the people that you serve with the work that you do, but also people who are going to read that and have an appreciation and also understand things from your viewpoint. Because I think a big problem with that sometimes is when these things happen, when like big injuries that completely take you out of a sport, sometimes people surrounding those people who want to be there and help and understand and support sometimes don't know what that fully is like for that person. So if you could kind of like what when you had your support system, what was the most important for you, for you to have them understand about your experience?
And this is for the ACL tears, correct?
Yeah. So like when then you experience that, having your support system, like what was it that you wanted them to understand that at that time to be able to help you and support you through that?
That's that's the thing I've really struggled with. I think like most guys in our society, I bottled that in very, very deep. Looking back, yeah, I have a lot of things that I wish they would have known, but
Mm-hmm.
in the moment, I was, a long time before I had any of the traumatic stuff, I was very, very numb to, pretty much anything. I would push the limit on, with substances and those kinds of things just to feel anything. So I think looking back, I just would have needed someone to help me get in touch, with those feelings and sit in them just briefly. Obviously, it's not fun initially, but the more you're able to come to terms with those, the less damage you're going to do. Because I waited years to, start, sifting through those, and it only gets harder the longer you let it sit there. So.
Mm-hmm. And also when you bring up that point of how the uncomfortableness of sitting in those feelings, but the impacts that are worse the more you avoid it.
Mhm.
And that's almost true in every scenario that I've come across with people who have similar experiences with this thing that they didn't know how to communicate it or express it. And it was something that they almost would hide like through a facade of almost like everything's good. Like there's nothing to worry about because of not wanting to put that on someone else or have those emotions. But I love that you talk about the benefit of that, of actually going through it. And yeah, it's going to be painful, but the fact that you're able to break through that, the benefits that brings in the long run. So like what would that have been like for you? So if you were not able to do that and you still had that feeling of shame associated with sitting in those feelings or addressing them, what
Mhm.
do you think the outcome of that would be?
That is, yeah. As far as I was on a pretty, um, you were talking about, opening up and helping people. It was a big internal conflict for me on whether or not I wanted to publish the book initially, just because a lot of the stuff I wrote this book in like, extremely quickly, just because it kind of flowed out of me. And a lot of the stuff I share is from kind of the deepest, darkest moments in my life and what led me to needing acceptance and commitment therapy, including obviously the ACL tears. But if I would have kept on that route, I definitely wouldn't be where I am today. I don't want to be morbid or anything, but I definitely wouldn't have been where I am today.
No, and that's an important, especially when you talk about the internal conflict that comes along with that, with having that of like, should I share this? And the uncertainty that comes across with that of, because when you think about, like you mentioned, similar to maybe other guys who've been in similar situations, not wanting to share that or express it because that can be seen as a weakness. And you shouldn't have that. You shouldn't be vulnerable. Like if someone does ask you, you can like brush it off almost, but you don't want to go there and really share that, because then you might be looked at in a light that you're not trying to be in. And it's almost like a misunderstanding of the situation. So I love that you kind of bring more attention to that piece, but especially with the story of having that. But now on the other side, looking back, when the book is coming out, knowing that people are going to read this and really resonate so much and actually be thankful for your story, because but that's what it is really just the vulnerability of actually getting it out and expressing it that you've been able to overcome. So, I mean, I'd even love to ask you too with that, what was it that helped you overcome that kind of division of like, should I do it? Should I not? Was there something in particular? Was it a combination of things?
What prompted me the most was first, I couldn't be a hypocrite. So one of the skills associated with ACT is self as a context. So essentially what that is, according to Dr. Hayes, who, constructed this framework, there's two versions of yourself. There's the true self, and then generally what most people operate under most of the time, unfortunately now, is the conceptualized self. So the conceptualized self is essentially a mask or a persona that we're trying to, put on. So essentially, a lot of the people, especially males, in our society, are wearing those heavily. We can't be hurt, even though we're hurt. We can't show weakness, even though we have tons of moments of weakness. So essentially what prompted me to do, the first thing that prompted me to do this is, I got to show who I really am, what I've really went through. There's no, you can't really worry about, looking tough or anything like that. And the second thing is I realized that I'm only going to be able to see so many patients. Like I only have so much time in a day. So no matter what I do, I only have a certain amount of slots to see patients. So to really reach as many people because like I said, I'm supremely, passionate about this and this patient population specifically. I want to be able to speak to as many of them as possible. And this was the best medium to do that. So.
That's really taking the mask off like completely. And I love that, because that is a very difficult thing to do, especially when you spent so long with that. As I know, like I can definitely relate to like hearing you go into that specifically and bring up the two versions of yourself, right? When you talk about the true self and the conceptual self, and having these both, and it's almost like a battle, like no, like stay this way, and you're trying to go this way, but you like have really helped overcome that by understanding like who are you keeping this information from that they need it. And when you really break that down of you only have so much time to see people in person, and you can't do that for everybody, but now that you have this as an extra way of reaching these other people through that. And I love how you also just, the book isn't just about recovering from ACL, because that's something that's a direction you could have gone in. You could have said, hey, like this is kind of the story of like with the athletic, and like focus more on that, but you dive into the psychological, the emotional, the stress, the relationships, also talking about the relationship you mentioned of having the relationship with someone who is struggling without being alcoholic and having that impact again on top of you as well with going through these different things with both the ACL tears and like having the willingness to be vulnerable and say, this is how I felt. This is really what it looked like. I had a period of time where I was having these thoughts of suicidal thinking and all these different things and actually saying that and then kind of showing like, but here's the solutions and here's what worked when it comes to acceptance and commitment therapy and really like diving deeper into those 6 pillars that I love that you kind of broke it down more into diffusion as well and kind of just walking us through like what that looks like and really what it's done for you in terms of having those thoughts where you almost prior to that did not have awareness of them. And that's something that I almost can relate to as well, like having them just almost on a cycling loop of like you're broken and then once it's almost like a snowball effect kind of, right? So it's like you start with this and then it just builds and builds and builds until it's all negative and you can't really even see the positive. So I'd love to ask you like, so can you walk us through, so in terms of a routine, like do you have a routine in place or like a morning routine or something like that that you do? And you don't always get to all the steps, but if you could kind of walk us through like what that looks like and how this is helpful for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing, there's no specific routine. Now, that being said, I have stuff coming in the future, like more resources. But the biggest thing I would say for someone who's looking to start on this path, whether or not, no matter if you had an injury or not, like I said, I've had a heck of a time because yes, it's a book about torn ACLs, but it's really about, I mean, that's almost in the background at times. So essentially the most important thing for me, yes, I saw the most immediate growth from diffusion, but the one that helps the most just from a day-to-day perspective is mindfulness. So is being present, because we're all so busy, we're looking forward, anxiety about the future, especially with all the, inflation, the wars, what am I doing next week? I'm so busy. Or looking back and, I could look back and be very depressed about the things I missed out on, because of my injuries or, other traumatic experiences. So truly living in the moment, which is hard, with social media and everything like that. You can't just be mindfully scrolling. That doesn't necessarily work, but living in the moment. And then when a bad thought or a good thought or whatever the case may be comes into your mind, you can address it. You can notice yourself as you're talking to people. If you're operating under, the conceptual self or a true self, you can really see if you're learning anything through acceptance, and then values and action, purposeful action are kind of the last two. And you can really gauge those things better if you're being mindful. If you're just running through your day, just going from one task to the next and barely living in the moment at all, you're really going to miss most of those opportunities to work on the things you really need to.
Wow. And I love that you kind of dive into the reason for mindfulness, especially with so much going on, like the difficulty it is to have that at times. So when you talk about the mindfulness piece, what do you do to stay mindful, or what practices do you have?
Yeah. So what I do personally, and it's going to be kind of different for everyone, like there's breathing, there's all kinds of stuff, but what really works for me is my anxiety is so bad that I usually have like an ache in my chest almost. So if I just stop what I'm doing, because I undoubtedly, I'm just like everyone else, I get going doing too many things at once. I'm trying to cook and answer emails and whatever the case may be. If I stop what I'm doing and really just focus on that spot, it actually helps me relax a little bit. And then I can shift my focus to different parts of my body. So, okay, now let's feel the sole of my left foot. Okay. And after, focusing there, I switch. I just move my perspective around my body a little bit. That's what's worked for me. It's going to be a little different for everyone. There's a number of different ways to do it, but that's what I've had the most success with.
Yeah, no, I love how you also talk about how that relates to helping with anxiety that you talk about with like having the anxiety and then being able to have that focus of noticing where in your body that pain or that ache is coming from, and then giving yourself the space and the grace to even address that, because it could be easy just to push it off and
Mhm.
just continue to like push through. I need to get this done. I need to do this. I need to do this. I can't do this. But giving yourself that peace, I think, is huge, because it is easy to get so caught up and
Mhm.
not want to even like take that break. But you're giving yourself that, and I feel like it does make a huge impact and difference. And also when you're talking about the breathing techniques and just anything else that people can access online or try, or different videos you can watch, or just asking people around you like what works for you when it comes to mindfulness, because that's the biggest piece of how you've been able to
Mhm.
capture these thoughts, like you mentioned, like when you have a good thought or bad thought or whatever it is come up, to be able to respond to that in the moment, instead of thinking back to the things that you missed out on when you talk about with the injury, like, oh, I missed out on this or this opportunity or
Mhm.
these different things. Being able to process that in the moment, in real time, I think is huge. And that brings me again to something else I want to ask you, that I always think this is such a really good point, because everyone always has a different insight. And don't say mindfulness for this one, because you we already said this, but when it comes down for you, so it doesn't have to be in your daily routine or anything like that, but if you could tell us, Keagen, what are you doing right now in this moment in time to master your mental?
Mhm. I would say for sure. I'm rather new to the podcasting world. I've been in it for about a month or so. So one thing that I'm doing personally is focusing on that self skill, in not trying to portray anything that's not uniquely me to
Mhm.
your audience. So that's something that I've had to continue to work on, because as I start these new experiences, you kind of have the tendency to go back under who you want to, the persona you want to have, instead of
Mhm.
being what you really are. So.
Oh my gosh. I love that, because that it is, and it's very true. Like and that goes back to the point that you made too, of getting out of your comfort zone and
Mhm.
doing more of this. And again, like speaking about your story and really showing that side of yourself that you're revealing in the book, and not, going back to hiding behind the pieces of not wanting to fully get into the details. Cause I definitely relate to that as well, of having those moments where maybe someone comes up to you and they say, hey, like, what is the book about? And you might have like a little panic come up, or anxiety or like nervousness of like, I'll just tell you like a brief little sentence, because I don't want to fully dive into it, because I don't know how this person might react or respond. But
Mhm.
that goes back to the point you said again earlier, of the more you do something, the more you kind of put yourself in that zone to be uncomfortable. And when you call it failure, like maybe if you say, oh, this is what it's about, and then someone's like, oh my gosh, like, how could, like, I don't know if I could ever reveal that or talk about that, or they might say something, that isn't what you thought the response would be. But
Mhm.
I love that, because the more that you do this, that you're really allowing yourself, and you're actually giving yourself a gift,
Mhm.
that you wouldn't have otherwise even realized if you didn't continue to do that. So I think that's extremely powerful, and I'm super excited for the book to come out, when you said May 17th as well. And I definitely want you guys to go sign up. You have a newsletter on your website, so we're going to talk about that and more places that everyone can connect with you and learn more. So let us know, where can we find you?
Yeah, probably the easiest place to find me right now is my website. It's my first name, last name.com, and it's going to give people fits. My dad, who's a notoriously bad speller, spelled my name. So it's Keagen, Keagen Hadley, HADLEY.com.
Perfect.
My blog talks about fitness in general, health, obviously mental health, and then injuries. So
Oh, I love it. I love it, love it, love it. And this has been absolutely amazing. And like, I just want to thank you for sharing your story and coming out here today. And also in line with that, sharing the tips and things that you've learned along the way and along the journey in terms of like, solutions, how to access those solutions when you're talking about therapy and your thoughts and really these two versions of yourself and really being able to tap into this and do it because like you said, because that just goes to show that another example of this of a powerful story in which you did it and you accomplished it. And there has definitely been moments in which you thought you couldn't share the story, you couldn't publish the book, you couldn't be vulnerable, and you overcame that. And that just goes to show that to show people that you can do it as well. So this is the message I want to leave you guys with too, is just to be again so thankful for you for being here and tuning in and listening to Keagen's story. And definitely go on his website. I'll put that in the notes as well, so connect with him. And yes, the book Torn is going to be on there as well, so coming out May 17th of this year. And it's Torn: Overcoming the Psychological Challenges Post-ACL Injury. So thank you so much, you guys, for being here. And I hope that you have a wonderful day or night, depending on what time it is for you. And I also want to say bye to you guys and bye to Keagen. So thanks, Keagen, for being here. It's been awesome.
Yeah, my pleasure. Talk soon.